Hello everyone, Adriel Peita from the Geopolitical Mundial channel here, and let's check out today's news, right? Saturday, May 23rd. So, what are we going to talk about here? It's a piece of news that came out in the middle of the week which I thought would be interesting for us to discuss, and it's this one right here. Iran is rebuilding its military power faster than the United States predicted, sources say. Iran has already resumed part of its drone production during the ceasefire with the United States, which began in early April. This is a sign that it is quickly rebuilding certain military capabilities that were degraded by joint attacks from the United States and Israel, according to sources familiar with American intelligence assessments. Four sources told CNN that American intelligence indicates the Iranian armed forces are rebuilding much more quickly than initially estimated. The rebuilding of military capabilities, including the replacement of missile sites, launchers, and the production capacity of essential weapon systems destroyed during the current conflict, means that Iran remains a significant threat to regional allies if President Trump resumes the bombing campaign, according to four sources familiar with the intelligence services. This also casts doubt on claims about the extent to which the joint United States and Israel attacks have degraded the Iranian armed forces in the long term. Although the time to restart production of different weapon components varies, some U.S. intelligence estimates indicate that Iran could fully rebuild its drone strike capability in just 6 months, CNN reported, citing one of the sources. The Iranians have surpassed all the deadlines set by the intelligence community for reconstruction, the source said. Drone attacks are a particular concern for regional allies. If hostilities resume, Iran could increase its missile production capacity, which was significantly reduced with more drone launches. Stay alert. Against Israel and the Gulf countries, which are within the range of both weapon systems, Trump has repeatedly threatened to resume combat operations against Iran if the two countries do not reach an agreement to end the war. He even stated publicly this Tuesday that he was 1 hour away from restarting the bombings, which means that these military capabilities could be put into action. Iran managed to rebuild much faster than expected due to a combination of factors, ranging from the support received from Russia and China to the fact that the United States and Israel did not cause as much damage as the two countries expected, according to one of CNN's sources. So that's how it goes, right? People criticize the government. They don't believe in government reports, but when it's the government of the United States or Israel, then they believe everything they say without question. Look, all the independent analysts, whether they were retired intelligence officers, retired military personnel, or from the military or the private intelligence sector, or even the more professional intel crowd, made it very clear that the American attacks were not causing as much damage as the American government was claiming. That was obvious, but you know how it is. If we say that, we're immediately accused of being Russophiles or Iran supporters in this case, right? That we're supporting a dictatorship. People want us to magically ignore reality in the face of evidence just to pick a side, and then they accuse us of being biased. First, we showed that they were using decoys, right? Yeah, bait, right? In other words, some old vehicles that no longer worked were used to attract the attention of the American and Israeli air forces, as well as fake vehicles, probably made out of wood with iron and 3D paint. And then, of course, in the middle of all that, during the attacks, there were people who saw the real image and said, "Hey, didn't you say it was all fake?" No, nobody said it was all fake. Nobody said it was all fake. What was said is that a good part, nobody knows how much, was fake. But nobody ever came and said categorically all the attacks were against fake targets. No one, absolutely no one. But that's how it is. People go to extremes for convenience. For example, China continued supplying Iran with components during the conflict that can be used to build missiles, according to sources familiar with American intelligence assessments. But again, that's it. Although this supply has probably been reduced by the ongoing American blockade, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu told CBS last week that China is supplying Iran with components for missile manufacturing, but he refused to give further details. Israel has adopted an extremely hostile stance toward everything related to China in recent times. Let's see how this will develop. The spokesperson for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Guo Jiankun, denied the allegation during a press conference, stating that it is not based on facts. However, Iran maintains ballistic missile capability, drone strike capability, and air defense, despite the serious damage inflicted by joint attacks from the United States and Israel, according to recent assessments by American intelligence. Take a look. All the evidence we have shows that first, Trump had announced that more than 90% of Iran's missile capability had been destroyed. So that was an absurd overestimation. Absurd. Most likely it was somewhere between 20 and 30% destroyed. 60 to 80 to 70% of the missile launch capacity remains intact, okay? This is a colder and more, how can I say, more accurate analysis of reality. There was exaggeration on the part of the Trump administration, but then what would explain the drop in missile launches, Leon? After all, you can't deny that the number of missiles launched has been decreasing over time with a slight uptick in the last few days. That also shows there was an uptick in missile attacks, right? But still, it's lower than at the beginning. So why did it decrease? Simple. Although Iran's missile launch capability wasn't hit that hard, their air defense capability was severely degraded, okay? If it wasn't 100%, it was something above 80%. So the missile launchers, they stay in bunkers. They couldn't be exposed to Israeli attacks because Israel and the United States were controlling things, actually controlling Iranian airspace. Exposing those missile launchers would inevitably put them under fire to be destroyed. So they had to take advantage of windows of opportunity to be able to launch those missiles. And remember that there were some reports that even the Iranian Air Force, which was supposed to have been wiped out, is still active, right? There's a reason these American failures happened, which I'll explain in a moment, right? Before people start saying you're anti-American, it's not about being anti-American. The United States really messed up this time, okay? But we'll get to that. This means that the rapid rebuilding of military production capacity isn't starting from scratch. The United States Central Command spokesperson declined to comment, saying the command does not discuss intelligence matters. The Pentagon spokesperson told CNN in a statement that the United States Armed Forces are the most powerful in the world and have everything they need to carry out their missions at the time and place chosen by the president. That's true, but they didn't put what they needed there to face the country. Iran, that's the point. We carried out several very successful operations in all combatant commands, ensuring that the American armed forces have a wide arsenal of capabilities to protect our people and our interests. The Middle East also isn't in America's interest. But the petrodollar, forget the petrodollar. The petrodollar was a very, very, very efficient economic tool, but it was never a leverage point, a foundation for the geopolitical power of the United States. Never. It never reached that level. If they lose the petrodollar, if the United States loses the petrodollar, it's a blow, but it's not the end of the world for them. And by the way, it won't change much. In April, CNN reported that American intelligence assessed that approximately half of the missile launchers had survived the attacks. You can add more to that, like I said, from 70 to 80%. A recent report raised that number to two-thirds, partly due to the ongoing ceasefire, which gave Iran time to unearth launchers that might have been buried. In previous attacks, according to sources familiar with the intelligence, the total of the American intelligence assessment may include launchers that are currently inaccessible, such as those buried by attacks but not destroyed. Thousands of Iranian drones still exist, approximately 50% of the country's drone capacity, according to intelligence information previously released by two CNN sources. Drones, the Iranians' drone capacity is practically untouched in that sense, okay? The drones, they don't need as much complexity to be launched as missiles do. So, like the missiles, the Iranians still had to keep retrieving them from exposure to American airstrikes so they wouldn't lose the launches. The drones are much simpler and are much more dispersed, spread throughout the country. So like the drone capability is very likely almost unchanged and untouched, okay? These missiles represent a fundamental capability that allows Iran to threaten maritime traffic. No, okay, I skipped a bit here. Intelligence showed that a large part of Iran's coastal defense cruise missiles was intact, which matches the American strategy of not focusing their air campaign on coastal military targets, although they did hit ships. It's worth remembering that we still have very little information about most of the Iranian submarines that disappeared. Where most of the Iranian submarines went, nobody knows. Everything indicates that they submerged and went to strategic positions there and are probably waiting to launch attacks. Probably, or they were also withdrawn so they wouldn't be destroyed and are in some defensive position because we don't really have much information about the operational quality of these submarines. We don't really know if they're in good condition or not, do we? Probably some of them are not in good condition. It's worth remembering that Iran struggles with military equipment maintenance because spare parts are hard to get under sanctions. But some of them are operational, no doubt about it. But where they are, we don't know, right? And why are they quiet? They definitely weren't destroyed because there was little confirmation of that from the United States. So some of them are somewhere, right? Let's wait and see. So one assumption is that it's very likely the Iranians didn't actually use them against the American warships. Because if they use them, they not only expose them, like eventually imagine if an American ship or aircraft carrier is destroyed, taking the lives of hundreds or thousands of American soldiers. This could have repercussions in the United States to the point where, then yes, the American population could start supporting the war. And, hypothetically, right, I think that even in that case, there still wouldn't be a pro-war mobilization. But could it, in the face of these images, give the United States room to actually declare total war and then try to mobilize its full force against Iran, which Iran also doesn't want? Make no mistake about that. In a full-scale war between the United States and Iran, the United States would win. Make no mistake. It's like I said in the other video. The story of David versus Goliath, that's the exception. It's rare for David to beat Goliath. It's rare. It's not common. Just like I say. And there are still people who believe that Ukraine can beat Russia. Ukraine can't beat Russia. It's not going to beat Russia. Russia sees Ukraine as an existential threat. The Russians see Ukraine as an existential threat, and they won't lose the war. Don't get your hopes up. Would the regime change if Putin dies? Would that mean the regime in Russia had changed? Every political alternative, when you look at the Russian leadership, the people who could present themselves as an alternative to Putin, fill the post-Putin vacuum, they are all much more radically anti-Western than Putin himself. Does that mean all of Russia is anti-Western? No, no. But those who are politically organized to fill the post-Putin vacuum are. Okay? The pro-Western ones are practically drained of political power in Russia. And it's not just because of political persecution or Russian authoritarianism, it's because they don't have a social base. Also, except maybe in Moscow and Sao Paulo, there isn't enough support to grow a political position favorable to them, okay? So let it go. Russia is not going to lose the war in Ukraine. Stop believing that. But the Ukrainians are, and the Russians are struggling, right? It doesn't matter. The Russians are not going to lose. They won't suffer a strategic level defeat. They won't be expelled from Ukraine. They won't. Just like the United States, if they go all in on Iran, they won't be defeated. Adriel, but you made a video saying that in the case of an occupation, they could face guerrilla warfare just like it happened in Iraq and then have problems. Look, again, people think all wars are the same. Wars are not all the same. There are many forms of war. One thing is to overthrow the current regime, to take down the regular armed forces. That's the part nowadays for the major powers. That's actually the easier part. The hardest part is the occupation. Because then, as part of the occupation, you have to deal with military groups, militarized groups, militias that are not formally identified, who won't play by the rules, won't fight by the rules of war, won't wear uniforms, they'll blend in. With the civilian population involved, it ends up making life harder for the occupier. That's a detail people can't forget. There are different kinds of war, many different kinds. Let's continue. We'll cover that later. But make no mistake, Russia won't lose in Ukraine, and if the US fully commits to Iran, it won't lose there either. Just like Gaza won't be able to push back the Israelis either. So stop thinking that life is like a video game where the little guy faces the big boss and manages to win. That's not how life works, okay? Let's go. This includes rebuilding their internal defense base, which, according to Commander Brad Cooper, was practically eliminated. Operation Epic Fury degraded it a lot. I'll keep saying significantly. I think it's an ugly word. Significantly, significantly. It even seems like this text was generated by ChatGPT. But then, the commander's statement strongly contrasts with American intelligence assessments about Iran's ability to rebuild its military capabilities and the timeline for that. Again, those two sources are saying that. One of the sources familiar with recent American intelligence assessments told CNN that the damage to Iran's internal defense base likely set back its ability to rebuild by a few months, not years. Months, yes, without any doubt. Not years. Part of Iran's industrial base remains intact, which could further speed up the timeline for reconstituting certain capabilities, the source noted. Well, so understand this, okay? What was it that I said I was going to comment on? What was the big problem the United States had with Iran? It's not strength. The United States has strength. It's willingness. One thing that a lot of people, again, who watch channels that talk about military equipment, comparing strength as if it were Call of Duty or something like that, don't understand is that war is a political phenomenon. The military doesn't have any say in war. When they manage to have a stronger position in the war, it's when they acted politically. But what determines the military campaign of any country in the world is the political side. It's the politicians who will set the conditions to be met in order to declare victory. That's the first point. And it's the politicians who will determine, who will set for the military the conditions under which they can operate or not. This was the case in Iran where everything went wrong. The American government initially caught the American armed forces off guard with the attacks. They knew attacks were coming. They expected something more specific, not a campaign of this scale, because they simply didn't reallocate enough resources to deal with a country the size of Iran. They didn't reallocate a force to deal with a country of Iran's scale. They went in overconfident, just like Russia went in overconfident in Ukraine, and Iran is also a big country. And in the case of Iran, unlike Ukraine, it's an extremely mountainous country. And these mountains have been used to shelter bandits. And Iran has had underground facilities for 40 years. For 40 years, the Iranians have been preparing for this kind of conflict where they would suffer bombings. They have practically built underground cities. These complexes are huge. But those bunker buster bombs that explode bunkers, can they handle it? They can't. They can't. We already have simulations that show how much damage they can do. Some of these mountains are so deep. And on top of that, under so many layers of concrete. Those bunker busters can't get in. Given the way it was carried out, there was no way the Americans could have won. Now, if the United States tried a large-scale military campaign, deploying soldiers and everything else, then yes, but that's what I said. War is politics. Would the American population support it? That's the first point. Would there be enough money for a war of this scale, which would be dozens of times more expensive than the war in Iraq? That's also unlikely. And it wouldn't be just a few soldiers like it was against Iraq, where there were practically 120,000 American soldiers. For Iran, it would probably require something like 600,000 to 800,000 soldiers. In other words, it would be a much bigger military operation than the Vietnam War, right? So everything indicates that the Americans wouldn't be willing. But if they did get involved, there's no doubt they would win. But they didn't commit troops. They were very euphoric about the easy victory they had over Maduro's regime in Venezuela, and they thought it would be more or less the same thing in Iran. And then, wait, we killed many American and Iranian leaders, but didn't overthrow the regime? That's right, because the conditions were different. The rules of geopolitical physics in Afro-Eurasia work differently from the rules of physics in the Americas. It's as if they were two worlds in different galaxies. So it wouldn't be that easy for you to just go there and simply kill the leaders and overthrow the regime. Not when it comes to an organic regime like the Iranian regime. If it were an artificial regime like in the case of Iraq, like in the case of Syria, like even in the case of Libya, okay, in those cases it was possible, but these are different conditions. That's why you need to have perspective. Anthropological, sociological, historical, geopolitical, and not just military. Because, again, war is politics by other means. So if the United States went all in, they would win, but they underestimated. Besides that, there's another factor that's very important, okay? That was a mistake not only made by the United States and the Russians, but by almost every country in the world. Maybe China was the exception in this case, but almost every country in the world, which is the fact that they prepared for a war that they thought would be the war of the future forever. What kind of war is that? Asymmetric wars. Here we have to go back quite a bit in time. If we go back to 1990, during the Cold War, what did we have? Armies constantly prepared for conflicts between states, wars between countries. However, the Soviet Union came to an end. The first thing that happened was an identity crisis in NATO. Why do we need NATO if the Soviet Union no longer exists? This happened in parallel with NATO's expansion at the same time. In parallel. Paradoxically, but in parallel ways. But there was this crisis there. Everything pointed to this in the 1990s. For people who experienced the 1990s, it seemed unlikely that wars between countries would happen in the future. And then when you have a war there in Europe, the war in Yugoslavia, it was quickly overcome by NATO as well. Only with airstrikes, it was very simple, very easy. So everything indicated that things weren't going to change much because of that. And this was confirmed later in 2001 when September 11th happened. And with September 11, what do you have now? The war on terror. But now from 2000 to 2010, right? Moving into the 2010s. What's the context now? No longer the perspective of possible conflict between countries, because now the narrative was different. That there was interdependence between countries. So no country would risk going to war with another because everyone was tied together. The cost of war would be too high. Urbanization would make it harder. And all of this was true. But it wasn't enough to prevent conflicts between states. No. So what were the threats? Guerrilla groups, insurgencies, terrorism, organized crime, so the armed forces of almost the whole world. There was no more need for tanks. You don't use tanks against terrorist groups or insurgent groups. You use lighter vehicles because you need to have a quick response. Arrive quickly. That thing with helicopters that arrive fast, the guys come down on ropes, bam, or an armored vehicle, but one that has high speed. And the soldiers arrive there with equipment that's not so heavy, right? Robust, but the protective gear is a bit lighter because it's for urban combat which requires greater mobility. That was the doctrine all over the world. Everyone went in that direction. Even the Russians themselves, when in the 2000s they were overwhelmed, even in Chechnya, okay? You have to remember that. And they were often suffering terrorist attacks, right? So everyone went in that direction. Everyone prepared for the conflict. It was 26 years of building a military infrastructure, doctrine, strategy, equipment. Everything was focused on quick and asymmetric conflicts, on insurgency, and then suddenly 2022 arrives. You go back to having the threat of war between states. And now this becomes the new real threat. In parallel, there's still terrorism, which has lost a lot of ground in recent years. It still exists, but it no longer draws much attention. It still exists, but now doctrine will have to be adapted all over again. And doctrine will have to address countries updating their equipment and mindset, their thinking, and their strategy to deal with conflicts between states again, because that kind of got left behind. So all the difficulties Russia is having in Ukraine, the difficulties the United States is having in Iran, all of this has to do with that factor as well, of having prepared for a war, right? Those kinds of wars. And when wars between nation states return, symmetrical wars, now they're having to rack their brains and try to make up for the loss. Well, so all of these are factors that make things much more difficult. Well, for the West, they'll have to catch up. And now look at the situation of the Western countries. Will they be able to? Because the situation for the West is not good. As the left rose to power, the countries literally had their guts exposed. The United States adopted the woke policy to a level that greatly degraded their operational capacity. The United States, the American military today, is not the same American military it was back during the Iraq War, okay? Back during the Gulf War as well. The woke structure has seriously devastated the structure of the Western armed forces. The woke structure compared to Eastern countries. There's a lot more to it, okay? But the video is getting long, so let's leave it for the next one. Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed it. Consider becoming a member. By becoming a member, you help ensure the existence of the Geopolitical Mundial channel. Hugs. Bye-bye.